I used to think jobs involving famous people were more about ego than risk. But the moment I stepped into Beyoncé's house, that belief started to fall apart. It wasn't the wealth that unsettled me. It was how untouched everything felt, like it had been carefully staged to present a version of the truth. At the far end of the property was a room filled with soft colors and aged toys, but none of it belonged to her children. The air inside was stale, like time had been paused and left to rot in place, and before I even opened the floor, I already knew someone had buried more than furniture. Have you ever stepped into a room that felt like it was hiding something from you? Would you have walked away or kept digging? If you're still here, stay close. Subscribe because I need you to see what I found. I've worked in houses where the windows cost more than my yearly rate. I've scrubbed out things I wasn't supposed to see, left through back doors, signed papers that made sure I wouldn't talk. That's normal in this work, especially when the client's face is on magazine covers. But something about this one felt wrong before I even parked. The drive took me past 3 sets of gates. No address markers, just hedges that swallowed sound. The house was still from the outside, not abandoned, just untouched. It wasn't the kind of quiet that calms you. It was the kind that slows your step because you're suddenly unsure if you're supposed to be there. They had already opened the side entrance for me. No staff, no greeting, just a white envelope on a bench inside the mudroom. The letter inside was typed short, clinical. My task was isolated to one room, listed only as the playroom. I wasn't allowed to move anything. Just restore order and leave no trace of my visit. The NDA was stapled underneath. I've seen stranger requests. But the room I was led to didn't fit anything. It was 3 floors up, at the far end of a hall with no other doors. Thick carpet, padded walls, not soft for safety, just dense. The air smelled filtered, and not lived in. The room had toys, but they didn't show use. Dolls lined the walls in identical poses. Books stacked in perfect descending order by height. A tea set on a low table with liquid already poured. None of it disturbed. No dust, no crumbs, no fingerprints. It didn't feel arranged. It felt staged. I wasn't there to question. So I did the same thing I always do. I walked the perimeter, tested surfaces, logged the time. But I kept glancing at the floor. Something about the carpet didn't sit right. It wasn't age. It was tense. The weave around the baseboards didn't match the rest of the room. It looked stretched, like it had been pulled tight and then reset. I crouched, pressed near the wall, and noticed a metal frame just beneath the fabric. A hatch, flush against the subfloor. The carpet was a cover, not part of the design. I didn't open it right away. I stood back and checked the corners of the room again, more deliberately. Still no cameras, still no noise. I told myself it was just part of the insulation, maybe HVAC access, maybe wiring. But this wasn't a tech wing. There were no thermostats, no panels, no visible utilities. And this room, the playroom, wasn't listed on the blueprints they sent with the NDA. I looked at the hatch again. It had no latch, no screws, just a depression wide enough for a hand. I didn't want to touch it, but I did. The carpet lifted in one piece like it had been peeled back before. The hatch came up smoother than expected, no resistance, no dust in the seam. The underside was lined with foam. Beneath it, a narrow metal staircase. That was the first moment I realized I was below the house without taking a single step down. I should have stopped, reported it, left and pretended I never saw it. But something in my chest wouldn't let me pull the hatch shut. I just stared at the stairs, narrow, perfectly straight, coated in industrial paint, the kind you find in basements that aren't meant to be seen. There was no odor, no moisture. The air was dry, too dry. This wasn't storage. This wasn't an accident. This was access. I stood at the top of those stairs longer than I want to admit. Not out of fear, out of calculation. I've done enough subcontracted work to know when something's been disguised. And this didn't look new. This had dustless edges, repetitive wear, steps that hadn't rusted or warped because they were used. Recently, regularly, I stepped down. The walls closed in after the 3rd trid. Narrower than code allows. No railing. Just the hollow clang of my boots hitting metal. At the bottom was a corridor, straight, cold, silent. No lights, but it wasn't dark. Faint light came from wall slits every few feet. Not fixtures, but strips set into the seams. The kind of glow that comes with systems, not candles. I moved slowly, hands off the walls. Not because I was scared of grime, because I didn't want to smudge anything. This wasn't a forgotten tunnel. It was maintained. About 15 paces in, the hallway split into 2. One side curved out of view, the other continued straight. I chose the curve, thinking it might loop around. It didn't. It led to a small chamber, round, with polished walls and a single chair bolted into the floor. The chair was too low for comfort. There were scratches on the tile where it had been rotated over and over again in the same narrow radius. There were no straps, no stains, no signs of violence. But the room still felt used. And that made it worse. I didn't stay long. I backed out and took the straight path. Another hallway, this one slightly downward. Same light, same smooth concrete. I passed 3 doors, flush, no handles. Just gaps where your fingers could pull. I opened one. Inside was a narrow room lined with shelves. Nothing on them. But the shelf dimensions were specific, not wide, not tall. Uniform. You don't build storage like that for comfort. You build it for volume. Each shelf had a small circular indentation near the front, recessed, as if something round had sat in each one. I pulled my hand away. There was a sticky warmth in my palm. The shelves were clean, but the material felt worn, not chipped, just touched. Too many times. I started feeling that pressure again, not from fear, from familiarity. I'd seen this kind of build before. Different house, different name. Same design logic. Narrow movement, dead air, mechanical silence. Not a home, a system. That's when I noticed the flooring. It wasn't tile or wood or polished cement. It was rubber, textured and sealed at the corners. You don't put down that kind of material unless you expect traffic. Small, frequent, controlled movement, the kind that doesn't wear evenly. The end of the hallway had a recessed panel. No lock, just a shallow push plate. I didn't go further. Instead, I stepped back and just stood there, cataloging every inch. There were no family photos, no clutter, no forgotten belongings, only geometry and function. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a basement, it wasn't storage. It wasn't panic proofing or celebrity paranoia. This was deliberate. This was infrastructure. And above it all was a playroom with staged dolls and a teacup set that had never been sipped. It wasn't that the room was too clean. It was that nothing in it was ever touched. I climbed back up without touching the walls, closed the hatch, reset the carpet, walked out the door and left it ajar. I didn't take anything, didn't photograph it. I just needed time to decide if I was going to pretend I hadn't seen it. The hallway outside felt even longer now. The contrast between the house and what was beneath it was too sharp. I passed the same framed awards, the same curated lighting, the same sterile order. I washed my hands in the mudroom before leaving, even though I hadn't gotten them dirty. My fingertips still felt something they weren't supposed to. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I drove back. No call, no contract extension. I just said I'd left something behind, and the gate buzzed me through. No one stopped me. No staff asked questions. No cameras turned my way. It was as if they expected it. I went straight up to the playroom again. The toys were untouched, exactly as I'd left them. I didn't waste time pretending to work. I lifted the carpet, opened the hatch, and went back down. This time I brought gloves. At the bottom, I turned left again, past the chair, past the shelves, and took the downward path where I'd stopped before. I pushed the recessed panel. It swung inward with no resistance. Inside was a chamber larger than I expected, long, low, ceilinged, with soft blue light bleeding from hidden strips. On either side were built-in nooks, like booths. Each one framed, cushioned, numbered. Nothing inside, no cushions out of place, no personal items. But on the far wall was a ladder, metal, narrow, not bolted, set into a recess. I climbed it. It led into a crawl space. Not a vent, not a shaft. A corridor barely wide enough to move through on hands and knees. It stretched out ahead, a long tube lined in foam insulation, branching off in symmetrical forks. There were tags taped at the junctions, handwritten letters, faded as if they'd been handled and reused. I froze there for a moment, knees pressed to the floor, breathing against insulation that didn't smell like dust. It smelled like latex and air freshener. Not a tunnel built to hide. A tunnel built to move through, quietly, repeatedly. I turned and backed out. Crawling in reverse was harder than I expected. Every movement echoed into the foam. Back in the chamber, I noticed the vents, not ceiling ducts, low wall vents, placed at ankle height, set in rows. The same spacing I'd seen in that estate upstate, where the walls were too thick for a single family build. At the time, I thought it was just paranoia money, panic rooms, soundproofing. But this was the second house where I saw the same ducting, the same crawl spaces, the same markings. I looked at the walls more closely. They were seamless. Something felt imprinted behind them. Subtle patches where the paint curved differently like hidden joints. I tapped one lightly, hollow. Then I heard it, not a sound, a hum, low, mechanical, deep in the structure, not running water, not HVAC. something that pulsed, and then stopped. That's when I realized this entire lower structure didn't connect to the rest of the house. Not directly. The walls didn't show junction boxes. The lights weren't powered by the same grid. It was self-contained, self-powered, and perfectly hidden beneath a room no child had ever touched. There's a layout I've seen enough times now that it doesn't feel random. Same core parts, same hiding logic. A main access point disguised as something innocent. Secondary paths disguised as infrastructure. Everything sealed. Everything mute. You don't get those kinds of consistencies unless someone's building from a shared plan. This was the fourth time I'd seen that plan. First time was in Hidden Hills. House wasn't famous yet. Belonged to a TV producer. Same contract terms. Same overpay. One room restricted. One staircase that shouldn't have existed. Back then I thought it was just rich person paranoia. But I found an elevator shaft that led nowhere, sealed off at both ends, with padded walls and airflow designed to move from one space to another, without any sound leakage. Second time was Calabasas. Couple owned 5 homes but only lived in one. I was told to deep service a theater room that didn't show up on their online walkthroughs. That's where I first saw the low ducts. Not HVAC style, grid fed and anchored directly into the walls. No supply or return, just circulation. Like they needed fresh air without noise. And then there was Miami. The property was massive, too big for one family. The job was supposed to be top floor only, but they left a utility panel open by mistake. I checked the crawl space. Found printed labels on the wall: studs, service corridor A, not ductwork, not wiring, routing paths. I didn't report any of it. I needed the work. I needed the silence to stay employed. But this house, Beyoncé's, was the first one that didn't even pretend. This wasn't a panic room or a safety tunnel. It wasn't overbuilt to impress. It was practical. Quiet floorboards, rubber insulation, directional light slits every 3 meters. The vents were too low for temperature control. They were positioned for breathing. The air smelled like something had been kept moving, not human scent, not mold, just processed. The kind of stale you get when a system runs constantly to keep odors from settling. I traced the corridor back toward the crawl space, following the slope path. On the floor, I found faint markings, not scratches, drag lines, repeated rotes. Whatever moved down here had patterns, not in panic, in routine. And the crawl space I'd backed out of, it had 5 branches, not 1, not 2, 5, each forked cleanly, foam-lined, identical in build, measured by hand. You don't get that without schematics. Someone built this with intention, not just to hide, to use. And I'd bet money this wasn't the only house in her name with this system underneath. That's what started clawing at me, the idea that this wasn't custom. It was standard. Standard for who? Because I know which contractors do this kind of work. I've seen the insulation brands, the fasteners, the tagging systems. This wasn't patchwork, it was uniform. They were building a network. And no one was talking about it. Because people like me don't talk. Because people like me are hired to make sure no trace remains. There was a girl missing in Austin 2 years ago. Blonde. 6. Foster system. I don't remember her name, but I remember the house. It was just outside the city, buried in a ridge. The kind of place where the house number is hidden behind vines. I'd been hired to deep sanitize a lower floor after a construction crew abandoned their final walkthrough. NDA, standard rate, same clauses. The job didn't bother me until I got into the media room. The walls had been freshly painted, but the ventilation system was older than the rest of the house. The dimensions didn't match. There were ducts where there shouldn't have been, and every third corner had a recessed port with magnetic seams. I traced one of them to a sealed shaft that led into a side room, one not visible from the rest of the floor plan. It had foam panels, a light slit, and 2 built-in benches along the wall. No labels, no drawers, just space. When I logged it in my own notes later, I marked it as holding alcove. It was the only phrase that made sense. The room wasn't a living space. It wasn't for guests. It was a pause point. 3 weeks later, I was watching the news and saw the girl's picture. Last seen 2 blocks from that estate. No known connections. No leads. They never found her. I pulled up my records that same night. I don't usually keep backups. Too risky. But something about that job had made me archive the build specs. And there it was. Same wall dimensions. Same floor angles. Same electrical signature. Everything matched. That was the first time I started looking for patterns. Now, in Beyoncé's house, I didn't need a file. I didn't need a second opinion. It was the same structure, down to the angled crawl space, the same insulated curves, the same stage chambers with nothing human inside. It doesn't feel real until you line it up. until you stop seeing rooms and start seeing systems. And once you do, it's hard to unsee. They weren't hiding a body. They were moving something. Not just in Austin, not just here. Every estate I'd been hired to service with a limited access contract and sealed zones had one of these tunnels. Every house had identical design elements buried beneath different decor. Some used stone, some used fabric, some used brushed steel. But underneath the dressing, the blueprint was the same. Someone is handing out this design. Someone is managing the build. And someone is paying to keep it uniform so that people like me won't ask questions. And people like that girl never get found. I didn't make a report back then. And I won't pretend I didn't feel the weight of that now. Because now I know what I'm standing on. And I know whose name is on the gate above it. Has anyone else ever worked a job where everything felt off, but you kept your mouth shut because the money was good? I wonder how many of us have seen parts of this without knowing it. Jay-Z's name wasn't on any of the paperwork. That's how I knew to look for him. The cleaner the documents, the more deliberate the omissions. Beyoncé was listed as sole owner, trust managed, no co-signers. But the permit trail had too many middlemen. Contractors filed under closed LLCs, floor plans submitted, then pulled, then resubmitted under cosmetic revisions. Except the dimensions kept changing in ways that didn't match the visible property. That kind of shuffling takes logistics, and that's not Beyoncé. She's the face. He's the pattern. I pulled records from the other jobs. Calabasas, Hidden Hills, Miami, same signatures kept showing up. Not names, but companies. Shell firms based in Delaware, dissolved within 2 years. All of them listed as consulting or property optimization services. All of them linked by one registered agent who used the same legal proxy out of Manhattan. Jay-Z's people. He doesn't design the tunnels. He doesn't dig the crawl spaces. He's not that close to it. But he builds the paperwork that makes them disappear. You don't need to move children if you can move the structure. The estates he's touched, even indirectly, show the same footprint. Homes purchased under trusts, gutted under security upgrades, then flipped. Sometimes they go back on the market. Sometimes they stay empty. But the lower levels always vanish from the records. I once worked a teardown in the hills that was sold 6 months after one of these upgrades. The new buyers never saw the basement. It had been filled, sealed, then photographed like it never existed. The real estate trail is cleaner than any bleach. And that's what makes it so dangerous. The tunnels don't need to stay open. They just need to work once. Someone gets moved. Then the hatch is shut, the walls resealed, and the blueprint reprinted with new measurements. If someone comes asking questions, there's no evidence. Just a missing child and a property with no past. Jay-Z doesn't need to know what moved through the tunnels. He just needs to know how to erase the corridor once it's done. And he's good at it. Too good. I've worked with a company out of New Jersey that handled one of his teardown flips. They replaced 7 tons of subfloor and never questioned why it had already been reinforced. I asked the foreman why it needed redoing. He said they weren't told, just following spec. He didn't care. No one ever does. Because no one wants to admit what that level of precision is hiding. They just want the job done, the check cleared, and their name left out of the paperwork. The only reason I noticed any of it is because I was already looking. And even now, I'm still not sure who else sees it, or if I'm the only one tracing the crawl spaces that shouldn't exist. I left through the same door I came in. No alarms, no follow-up, no contact from the estate. They paid in full like nothing had happened. I was never asked for a report, just an invoice. That's what finally broke through. They weren't hiding what I saw. They expected it. Whatever system this is, it doesn't fear discovery. It relies on familiarity, on repetition, on the fact that people like me won't make noise. And even if we do, it sounds too far-fetched to matter. I kept thinking about the playroom, the way the dolls were arranged, how nothing had ever been touched. It wasn't designed to be used. It was a cover story with cushions. Something to explain away a room on the blueprints in case someone ever asked. But no one does. That tunnel wasn't added as an afterthought. It was part of the original build. Every corner, every recess, every duct and ladder and soft, lit wall, none of it felt improvised. There were no exposed screws. No marks from recent construction, no signs of retrofitting. This was intentional, architected, and Beyoncé's name is just the surface. The deeper I go into the files I've saved, the harder it is to shake the feeling that this isn't about any one person. Not her, not him, not any individual home. It's about design language, about repeatable infrastructure, invisible pathways that run beneath the image of power, threaded through estates no one ever questions, because wealth gives space, and space gives cover. I've stood in too many of these rooms now, not just the playroom but the hidden chambers, the access corridors, the vents, the built-in seating with no function. They're always too exact, too seamless, as if someone sold them as part of a catalog, discreet, modular, and easy to dismantle when no longer needed. They don't always hold someone, but they're always ready to. That's the part I can't let go of. It's not what I found under her house. It's how many other houses are already hiding the same thing, and how many of us have stepped over the hatch without realizing it was ever there. So, I just want to know from you, what's the strangest job you've ever had? The one you still think about sometimes. And if you're interested in knowing about hidden truths like this one, like, share and subscribe to this channel.